know that most of what you've seen, read, or heard about Billy the Kid is untrue? My name is Gail Cooper. I'm a medical doctor and forensic psychiatrist. My specialty is murder case consultation for the defense. For 20 years, I've used my expertise to uncover the real Billy the Kid. Researching over 40,000 pages of archival documents and books, I've written the revisionist history. It's shocking, it's liberating, and I've written books demolishing the hoaxes, hijacking the history. My talks will share with you what I've found. Cover-ups, misinformation, and fakery, to use Old West lingo, will bite the dust. This talk begins my revisionist history of how Governor Lew Wallace's disastrous testimony against Fort Stanton's past commander, NAM Dudley, doomed his pardon bargain with Billy Bonney. The information is from my book, The Lost Pardon of Billy the Kid, an analysis factoring in the Santa Fe Ring, Governor Lew Wallace's dilemma, and a territory in rebellion. There were many reasons why Governor Lew Wallace betrayed his pardon bargain with Billy Bonney after Billy fulfilled his part by testifying against the Santa Fe Ring murderers of attorney Houston Chapman. As discussed in Talk 21 and linked below, Wallace had many character flaws, including monumental selfishness. He also had an Achilles heel. As a Civil War Major General, he was disgraced for failing to arrive with his troops at Shiloh's first day of battle, almost causing the Union's defeat. He earned unforgiving hatred of its commander, General Ulysses S. Grant. It left Wallace obsessed with getting a pardon from Grant and terrified of angering military brass. It impacted his pardon bargain with Billy Bonney by a coincidence. Ongoing turmoil after the Lincoln County War, including Chapman's murder 7 months after its end, focused citizens' rage at the final battle's intervening Fort Stanton commander, Nathan Augustus Monroe Dudley. They knew Chapman had been assassinated in Lincoln to stop his intended prosecution of Dudley for enabling the murder of Alexander McSween and arson of his home, thus aiding defeat of the anti-ring freedom fighters. Wallace had been made governor by President Rutherford B. Hayes to pacify the territory. That caused his dilemma. To do it realistically would have pitted him against the powerful and vindictive Santa Fe Ring controlling the territory. They would have destroyed his political future. So, from his October 1st, 1878 arrival to Chapman's February 18th, 1879 murder, Wallace avoided going to Lincoln. To fake action, he used troops to pursue so-called outlaws whom he fabricated as causing the unrest. Billy Bonney was one he pursued. Chapman's murder ended that ploy. Wallace was forced to go to Lincoln. He was forced to take action against Dudley. So he was forced to relive Shiloh's nightmare of conflict with military brass. He was forced to remove Dudley as Fort Stanton's commander. That forced Wallace to testify against Dudley in his court of inquiry for possible court-martial, while he still tried to appease the ring. It failed. Dudley's ring-eyed lawyer trounced Wallace as an incompetent governor. Back came wounded pride of Shiloh. Back came his attempted escape by denying blame. Wallace had sunk into his Dudley disaster like walking into quicksand. It started with his first attempt at a quick fix of the territorial troubles. On his 44th day as governor, on November 13, 1878, he issued an amnesty proclamation pardoning everyone in the Lincoln County War except those indicted. Aware of Commander Dudley's illegal intervention in the final battle, he pardoned troops also. That was step one into the quagmire. Pardon implied wrongdoing, and if Dudley was labeled as guilty, so was the ring that had used him. Houston Chapman, as Susan McSween's lawyer, himself had started Wallace's disaster. On October 24, 1878, he wrote to Wallace stating, "I desire to call your attention to one person whose actions have been offensive in the extreme to a large number of the best citizens of that county, and that man is Colonel Dudley. I'm in possession of facts which make Colonel Dudley criminally responsible for the killing of Alexander McSween." Wallace struggled to avoid siding against Dudley. He wrote to New Mexico Territory's commander, Edward Hatch, that Chapman's accusations were, quote, incredible, meaning not believable. Then he blamed locals for wanting Dudley's removal as commander, not himself. That ploy failed. Hatch got Dudley to respond. On November 9th, Dudley, being prepared for litigation by the ring, sent Wallace fake affidavits against Susan McSween's chastity to undermine her charges. Dudley, or ring boss T.B. Catron writing for him, stated, "I am not here quietly to submit and allow such allegations against myself as Your Excellency has seen proper to forward to district headquarters without making an unqualified denial." On November 14th, Wallace responded to Hatch. Trying to placate, he wrote that Dudley's response was, quote, perfectly satisfactory. That would return to haunt him when he testified against Dudley. Dudley's ring-eyed lawyer would claim that he'd called the affidavits against Susan McSween perfectly satisfactory, so had already exonerated Dudley. On November 29th, Chapman wrote again to Wallace. He added the ring, writing, "The McSween men are willing to stand their trial or to observe your proclamation, provided the other side or ring observe it, but they will never allow themselves to be arrested by murderers like Colonel Dudley. I am now preparing a statement of facts for publication, which, I am sorry to say, will reflect upon you for not coming here in person." That hit Wallace. Father figures President Hayes and Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz would realize he was a failure. Between the devil and the deep blue sea, Wallace tried to placate Dudley. On November 30th, he proposed a private meeting to explain why he pardoned him. Like in Shiloh, Wallace missed the real battle. Now it should have been against Dudley and the ring. By December 7th, Wallace tried another quick fix. He wrote to Hatch requesting Dudley's removal as a local irritant. He again blamed complaining Lincolnites. Hatch ignored him. On December 14th, the ring sprang its trap in its Santa Fe Weekly New Mexican under the headline, "An Open Letter by Lieutenant Colonel N.A.M. Dudley, 9th Cavalry, to His Excellency Governor Lew Wallace." To preempt accusations of Dudley, it publicly blamed Wallace as a bad governor, garbled the Lincoln County War, blamed so-called outlaws, and had Dudley's officers vouch for him. Wallace folded. He refused to ruin his future ambitions. His humiliation was starting. Shiloh's specter was rising. His December 16th response was just a friendly invitation to Dudley's officers to meet with him for an explanation. On December 21st, nervous Wallace did damage control by writing to Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz. In his first battle with the ring, Wallace lost. He discredited Houston Chapman, proving that he'd betray to save himself. He wrote, "An individual by the name of Chapman went to the town of Lincoln and tried to get up a disturbance, but failed." Wallace also whined that Dudley was upset with him. In 3 months, Billy Bonney's pardon would depend on this flawed man whose sole loyalty was to himself. By December 31st, Wallace had descended deeper into the quicksand. He was in trouble with soldiers, up to Secretary of War George McCreary. By requesting Dudley's removal, he'd inadvertently blamed Dudley's superiors for the charges. General Edward Hatch, commanding District New Mexico, and above him Major General John Pope, commanding the Department of Missouri. And the silly reason Wallace had given for insulting them all was Dudley's being irritating. And a removal request by a civilian was frowned upon. So McCreary backed Dudley and wrote that Wallace should offer real charges if he had any. The Ring read between the lines that Wallace wasn't backing Chapman. Local ring boss James Dolan on December 31st sent Wallace a letter stating, "I and many of our citizens feel confident that if this man was silenced, the troubles would end." Unconsciously, Wallace agreed and did nothing to protect Chapman. What Wallace did do was travel to Colorado to meet his arriving wife and son at the railroad station and start redecorating the Palace of the Governors. He also toyed with visiting Lincoln. On February 11th, he wrote to New Mexico's chief quartermaster requesting a military escort. That may have accidentally sealed Chapman's assassination in 7 days, since the Ring feared Wallace allying with him. On February 18th, Chapman was murdered in Lincoln by James Dolan and Ring thugs Jesse Evans and Billy Campbell. Wallace's first response to Chapman's murder was blaming outlaws. His sources were an October 6, 1878 outlaw list with regulators sent him by Ringite U.S. Marshal John Sherman and input from James Dolan, whom he'd arrested and put in Fort Stanton. They accused William Bonney, the Kid, and his friend Eugenio Salazar. The Ring especially wanted them exterminated, since both teenagers were primed for anti-Ring rebellion. Wallace, with usual hyperbole, put a reward of $1,000 on the Kid, presumably dead or alive. On February 20th, he ordered Lincoln County Sheriff George Kimbrell to pursue them. Utterly out of touch, he directed anti-Ring Kimbrell to use Fort Stanton troops, the same troops that Kimbrell knew had terrorized Lincoln 7 months before. With macabre humor, even Commander Dudley joined the chase, reporting on February 24th that it was important to apprehend Bonney, alias Kid, since outlaws were causing, quote, considerable fright. On February 27th, Wallace finally reported Chapman's murder to Carl Schurz. Wallace's draft reveals him as an incompetent who lied to hide his mistakes. For Shiloh, he lied that he got wrong orders. The lie now was claiming Chapman's murder was by notorious characters and outlaws. He asked for soldiers to pursue them. One should remember that Schurz and President Hayes knew the ring was systematically murdering opponents, so Wallace and Washington were merely conducting a charade to keep the ring secret, and fake outlaws would be scapegoated until only one was left to kill, as Billy the Kid. So Wallace now floated to Schurz his fake plan of going to Lincoln to rid it of the outlaws causing the troubles. Lew Wallace didn't fool Grant County citizens. In 1876, they'd had their own rebellion against the ring. The March 1st Grant County Herald ridiculed Wallace for his interview in the Denver Tribune, in which he said, quote, he found the territory in a state of anarchy and confusion, and by systematic management he had brought about a state of prolonged peace. The article added snidely about Chapman. In our telegraphic columns today, we publish an account of another murder committed upon the principal street of the town of Lincoln. It is charitable to think that Governor Wallace supposed a good deal to have been accomplished, but the whole affair looks very much as though he had tried to manufacture capital from misrepresentation. Close quote. Lying Wallace could not escape mounting humiliation. Arriving in Lincoln on March 5, 1879, in what would be a stay till May 15th, Wallace faked action by chasing his so-called outlaws. But reality had already struck with Susan McSween's hiring of attorney Ira Leonard to replace murdered Chapman to continue her litigation against NAM Dudley. On March 4th, Leonard had filed charges against Dudley with Secretary of War George McCrary, and Dudley, under likely recommendation of Boss Catram, who had represented him in his two past court-martials, requested a military court of inquiry at Fort Stanton, assured that it would be rigged. Wallace knew Ira Leonard from recommending him for a judgeship. Wallace's outlaw myth didn't trick him. On May 20th, 1879, Leonard would write to Wallace about local bosses James Dolan and Lawrence Murphy, quote, they were part and parcel of the Santa Fe ring that has so long been an incubus on the government of this territory. On March 7th, Wallace wrote to General Hatch asking for Dudley's removal as commander. With Chapman's murder hanging over him, Hatch complied, and Dudley requested the court of inquiry. It would last from May 2nd to July 8th. On March 13th, Wallace got his only lucky break. He got Billy Bonney's pardon bargain letter, giving teeth to convicting Chapman's murderers by his eyewitness testimony. On April 4th, Wallace did dishonest damage control by minimizing the looming Dudley Court of Inquiry to Carl Schurz as an unfortunate intrusion on his attention for April's grand jury to start in 10 days. In fact, Wallace was doing little preparation for either. In the grand jury, Billy's testimony got indictments for Chapman's killers. Wallace not only issued no pardon, but also hid Billy's testimony from Hayes or Schurz. Billy, on his own, then testified against Dudley in the Court of Inquiry from May 28th to 29th, but Wallace never acknowledged that either. On April 25th, James Dolan tried to assassinate Ira Leonard to hamper the Court of Inquiry beginning on May 2nd. Wallace did nothing. Like Chapman, Leonard annoyingly acted like the voice of conscience, which Wallace didn't want to hear. Wallace was focused on his own crisis. His request for Dudley's removal as commander allied him to the Court of Inquiry's prosecution. That meant his attacking a military officer and the ring. It was the lowest point in his life other than the Battle of Shiloh. And in his corner would be mediocre military prosecutor Captain Henry H. Humphreys, 15th Infantry at Fort Bliss, assisted by lackluster Ira Leonard. Dudley's attorney was the best trial lawyer in the territory, Catron's law firm member Henry Waldo. Unbeknownst to Wallace, the chief judge of the three presiding was Dudley's best friend, Galusha Pennypacker from Fort Union. Wallace testified 4 days, May 12th to 15th. It was a disaster. Though a witness for the prosecution, he tried to shield Dudley and the ring. He even blamed the McSween side for causing the trouble. Revealed was that he'd gathered no evidence against Dudley. He hadn't even interviewed Susan McSween. Waldo made humiliatingly clear that he was an incompetent. Here are examples from the court transcript. On the first day of testimony, May 12th, Prosecutor Henry Humphreys reasonably tried to get Wallace to state charges against Dudley. Asked to elaborate on his March 7th removal request, stating that Dudley was an active partisan, Wallace answered that local people had accused Dudley of killing Alexander McSween. Waldo attacked. He said Wallace avoided the question. The court agreed. So Wallace spewed double talk. He said, "The charge is based upon certain acts of Colonel Dudley towards certain individuals or supposed members of the so-called McSween party." Brought up was Wallace's November 14th, 1878 letter to General Hatch saying that Dudley's response to him had been perfectly satisfactory. Wallace became defensive. He said the charges were by Houston Chapman, not him. He said satisfactory meant it was polite that Dudley wrote back to him. He said it didn't apply to Dudley's enclosed affidavits against Susan McSween's chastity. The first day proved to Henry Waldo that Wallace would be a pushover. The second day, May 13th, Prosecutor Humphreys questioned Wallace about Dudley's open letter to the press. Humphreys hoped to get Wallace to list charges that made him pardon Dudley. Instead, Wallace lied wildly. He said the open letter stopped his getting peace in Lincoln County because it mentioned the affidavits against Susan McSween. That made Chapman demand them from him. Because he refused to hand them over, Chapman made criminal charges against Dudley to rile up Lincolnites, and that caused Chapman's murder. Wallace was hiding the truth that the litigation was about Dudley's Lincoln County war crimes. Chapman was murdered to stop that litigation. The open letter was irrelevant. Wallace was betraying the prosecution to save himself. The third day, May 14th, poor prosecutor Henry Humphreys tried again to get Wallace to accuse Dudley, asking him what the military had done to make Wallace include them in his amnesty proclamation. Instead, Wallace despicably blamed Chapman and Susan McSween. He cast himself as protecting Dudley. He said, It came to my knowledge that it was the intention of certain parties living in Lincoln, who I had reason to believe were endeavoring to revive the McSween faction, intending commencement of prosecution of a criminal nature against Colonel Dudley. Mr. Chapman waited upon me in my office at Santa Fe, stated to me that he, amongst others, intended such a course, for which purpose it was his design to resort to the grand jury of the next court. I remonstrated against such a course, but without effect. I then resolved that such should not be done if I could help it, or at least could furnish Colonel Dudley with a plea in case of such prosecution. I did not stop to consider whether Colonel Dudley was guilty or not guilty in connection with the McSween killing affair. I foresaw if he were indicted, he would be put at a great cost, vexation, and harassment, and I foresaw he might be confronted by a partisan jury. I use the word officers, plural, to avoid mentioning, specially and singly, Lieutenant Colonel Dudley's name, for that I thought it would be offensive to him. Poor Prosecutor Humphreys tried again. He asked Wallace to list the charges he made to Hatch on March 7th when asking for Dudley's removal. Wallace answered that he had written, quote, that he, Colonel Dudley, is so compromised by connection with the troubles in the county that his usefulness in the effort now making to restore order is utterly gone. He blamed Lincolnites for dreading Dudley after the burning of the McSween house. But lawyer Wallace took no chance of sounding like an accuser. He added, "It was not then pretended that the charges were anything more than hearsay accusations." Wallace knew hearsay was of no legal value. Waldo, of course, objected to Wallace's giving hearsay. The court upheld his objection. Then came Henry Waldo's cross-examination. He went after Wallace's perfectly satisfactory statement, claiming it proved he backed the affidavits against Susan McSween. Wallace double-talked and never said he knew they were false and she was credible. Waldo then embarrassingly exposed Wallace's lack of preparation. Wallace couldn't recall a single report he'd supposedly read on Dudley or how many. Then Waldo questioned Wallace about not coming to Lincoln, heading to dereliction of duty, dangerously close to the wound of Shiloh. Waldo hissed, "Had you not been continuously in Santa Fe from the time of your arrival in the territory of New Mexico until the time of your departure for Lincoln?" When poor Prosecutor Humphreys tried to object that it was irrelevant, Waldo scornfully responded, "The witness has testified as to the effect of the open letter upon the people of Lincoln County. The object of the question is to show that he had no opportunity of judging the effects of said letter, not being present." The fourth day, May 15th, Henry Waldo continued his cross-examination, noting that Wallace blamed the open letter for agitating Susan McSween's friends and causing Chapman's murder. He demanded examples. Wallace repeated his hearsay claim. He said, "My knowledge is derived solely upon information received from others." He was intentionally betraying Susan McSween's case to save his skin. Waldo stated, "In your examination in chief, you state you made an investigation as to the situation of affairs in Lincoln County and as a consequence thereof reached the conclusion that a considerable portion of the people were suffering from intimidation caused by dread they had of Colonel Dudley. How long were you in the making of that investigation, and what was the extent and nature? Wallace stated that he talked to people from his March 5th arrival, but everyone was too afraid to give affidavits, so he had none. Here Wallace was lying. He was actually interviewing people about his outlaw fictions. Waldo continued, "How many persons did you talk to about the situation of affairs in Lincoln County?" Wallace answered, "I found that people who I met, almost without exception, were in dread of the military commandant, Colonel Dudley." Waldo asked for names. Wallace could only think of Juan Patron, apparently because he'd been visiting Billy at his house during Billy's sham arrest. Waldo had made Wallace look like a liar or an incompetent. Waldo then asked Wallace if he'd interviewed Dudley to get rebuttals. Looking stupid, Wallace answered, "I did not." Then Henry Waldo went for the jugular. He circled back to Wallace's admission that he'd based the charges in his letter of March 7th to General Hatch on hearsay. He then asked if Wallace wanted Hatch to act based on that. Wallace feebly said yes. Waldo had made Wallace look like a fool, using hearsay evidence, having no affidavits, no recall of informers' names, and avoiding Lincoln County. It obviously meant that his testimony was worthless. This was a flashback to Shiloh's utter failure. Waldo declared that he was finished with the witness. Poor Prosecutor Humphreys, in redirect, tried to salvage anything. He asked Wallace about the statements he got from Lincolnites. Wallace made things worse. He answered, "I never reduced any of their statements to writing or had them sworn to. These statements were given to me verbally." So Lawyer Wallace had admittedly collected no legally usable evidence against Dudley. After his testimony, Wallace retreated to Santa Fe, redecorating the palace of the governors and writing Ben-Hur about his hero's pardon from unjust accusation. Present during Lew Wallace's wretched testimony, attorney Ira Leonard stayed in touch with him. On June 6th, he wrote to him that he recognized the court of inquiry was rigged. He didn't guess that humiliated Wallace had abandoned him, Lincoln County troubles, and Billy Bonney's pardon. Leonard wrote, "I am thoroughly and completely disgusted. There's nothing to be looked or hoped from this tribunal. It is a farce on judicial investigation. This evidence against Dudley would hang a man in any country where right and justice prevailed." Ignoring Leonard, on June 11th, Wallace wrote to Carl Schurz to spin Boss Catherine's misusing his amnesty proclamation in the April to May grand jury to block prosecution of all indicted Ringites. Hypocrite Wallace pretended it was his own cost-saving plan. He wrote, "This leaves me at liberty to repeat for your better understanding that the old factions known respectively as the Murphy-Dolan and the McSween are as dead organizations, to which may be added now that my amnesty proclamation has had exactly the effect intended, which was to shear the past off. To illustrate, the grand jury impaneled for the recent county court was composed of men accounted of the McSween or anti-Dolan party, for it is undeniable that nearly all citizens eligible as grand jurors are of that persuasion. They found nearly 200 indictments, the whole, with a few exceptions, against the Dolan people. You cannot fail to see what would have come of trial of the accused, how long they would have lasted, the expenses to the county. As it was, most of the indicted appeared in court and pled the amnesty and bar of further prosecution. Hereafter, the labors of grand juries will be confined strictly to offenses subsequent to my proclamation. Then he used the outlaw myth, writing, "The only disturbing element remaining to be grappled with is the confederacy of outlaws." Taking no chances with rumor of his stupid testimony, Wallace flippantly declared he didn't want to be involved in local military conflicts because, quote, "they get me into personal quarrels for which life is too short." He concluded with self-praise, "It gives me great satisfaction to report the territory elsewhere in a prosperous state." Ira Leonard, unaware that he was abandoned, continued reporting to Wallace on the Court of Inquiry. On June 13th, he agonized that its out-of-control corruption was now blocking even his entering evidence against Dudley. He wrote, "If you ever saw 3 men, meaning the judges, who strained every effort to protect and shield an old scoundrel, this court have done it." Since March 21st, Billy had been in his sham arrest in Juan Patron's house, using that cover to testify against Chapman's murderers in the April grand jury to fulfill his pardon bargain with Lew Wallace. It got him no promised pardon, and Ringeye District Attorney Reinerson, colluding with Ringeye Judge Warren Bristol, changed his venue for his Lincoln County war indictments to Doña Ana County for a certain hanging sentence. Nevertheless, for his own anti-ring agenda, Billy stayed to testify on May 28th and 29th against Dudley at his Fort Stanton Court of Inquiry. On June 17th, certain that staying longer in Lincoln would be fatal, Billy simply left, apparently with Juan Patron's blessing. Wallace would later lie that it was a jailbreak that proved Billy broke the pardon bargain. On July 3rd, Wallace continued his mission of protecting himself. For the first time, he mentioned the ring to Schurz, still nervous that they would injure him. He wrote, "The only thing worth attention is the development of the conspiracy of which I have had knowledge for some time, looking to removal of a number of federal appointees, including myself. It is the expiring flurry of the old ring." So Wallace, knowing that he'd left the ring unchecked in Lincoln County, implied it was irrelevant since it was expiring, and ring-enabling Schurz just played along. For the complicit Hayes administration, Wallace was achieving with finesse what brutal removed Governor S.B. Axtell had failed, suppressing citizens without their realizing the malice. Possibly Wallace's precaution with Schurz came from knowing that the Court of Inquiry was ending and his disastrous testimony might be relayed to him and Hayes. In fact, Vicious Henry Waldo had a field day with it in his closing argument of July 5th. He certainly proved that the ring was far from expiring, as Wallace had fabricated to Schurz. Waldo sealed Wallace's humiliation, thereby recycling Shiloh's, and he chillingly revealed that Wallace's secret communications about the ring were known to its spies. Waldo jeered. The governor was in great alarm about the awful bugbear, the Santa Fe ring, preventing his confirmation. He wanted to manufacture some political thunder whose reverberation would resound in the halls of the Senate chamber in Washington. Waldo continued ridiculing Wallace. Nothing has been accomplished in the least that connects Colonel Dudley with anything which transpired in the town of Lincoln on the occasion of his presence there on the 19th and 20th day of July last, and all that has been truthfully told of his motives and actions reflects the highest credit upon him as a man and as a soldier. Notwithstanding all this, he has been branded as a conspirator, a robber, and a thief by no less a person than Governor Wallace to the commander of the district. Look at this for a moment. Governor Wallace had been in the county of Lincoln but one day, took no sworn or written testimony, never even inquired of the officers who were present with Colonel Dudley when he was in Lincoln at the time mentioned. Language strong enough and severe enough cannot be employed in denunciation of the hideous and monstrous wickedness of these bad men who united in their efforts to disgrace and ruin a man who had never harmed either of them, and that man an officer of high rank and long and distinguished service in the army. Here has Colonel Dudley been forced to submit to the humiliation and mortification of knowing that such charges had been lodged against him with the Department of War in Washington. Lew Wallace and Ira E. Leonard are alone responsible for this harassing case. By their act, this disgrace has been brought upon a pure, humane, and just man. Time does not remain to Colonel Dudley to clear away the stain by them placed upon his name and character. The best years of his life are past and gone, spent in the service of his country. Governor Wallace did not come to Lincoln to learn the truth. He came to accomplish the removal of Colonel Dudley, even if he had to write as evil and malicious a letter as that upon which the removal was effected. Did Governor Wallace seek true knowledge of Colonel Dudley's relations to Lincoln County matters? Why did he not come to officers of the post? He went directly to Lincoln and talked with a few rabid and malignant partisans. He wants somebody to lay the blame upon. His amnesty proclamation was a weak and ridiculous idea in the first place. What the villains who had made a hell of Lincoln County needed was a gallows, not a pardon. The whole truth about that proclamation is that just about the time the governor was in great alarm about the awful bugbear, the Santa Fe ring, preventing his confirmation, he wanted to manufacture some political thunder whose reverberation would resound in the halls of the Senate chamber in Washington. He had been sent specifically to pacify the troubles in New Mexico. To this, his official announcement of the complete success of his efforts to pacification in Lincoln County is promulgated. Waldo gloated theatrically. The foul conspiracy to disgrace and ruin Colonel Dudley, concocted by Lew Wallace, Ira E. Leonard, and Sue E. McSween, has ended in utter and ignominious failure. Colonel Dudley comes forth from this fiery ordeal unscathed. No blemish rests on his character, no cloud to darken his fame. So, Wallace was once again branded with Shiloh-like accusation of ignominious failure. The same day, July 5th, 1879, Chief Judge Galusha Pennypacker, Dudley's best friend, with the other two judges, declared, "In view of the evidence adduced, the court is of the opinion that Lieutenant Colonel Dudley has not been guilty of any violation of law or orders, and that the act of proceeding to the town of Lincoln on the 19th day of July, 1878, was prompted by the most humane and worthy motives and of good military judgment under exceptional circumstances. The court is of the opinion that none of the allegations made against Lieutenant Colonel Dudley by His Excellency the Governor of New Mexico or by Ira E. Leonard have been sustained, and that proceedings before a court-martial are therefore unnecessary. On July 30th, Wallace did damage control for himself with Carl Schurz. He wrote, "The Dudley investigation is at an end. If what I hear is true, however, it must have been one of the most extraordinary tribunals ever assembled. The defense was permitted to prosecute me. There is consequently no remedy left me but to request that the record be sent for by the Honorable Secretary of War, and that such matters as may be there found affecting my personal or official honor, I may be furnished an opportunity for denial in case the record leaves a harmful doubt against me in the mind of the President." On August 26th, Wallace got reassurance. Secretary of War George McCrary wrote, "There is nothing in the proceedings of the court to reflect injuriously upon the course pursued by Governor Wallace." In truth, as long as Wallace left the Santa Fe ring alone, he satisfied Hayes and his cabinet. By a September 15th letter to Carl Schurz, Wallace reduced Lincoln County's crisis to, quote, "the killing of outlaws by outlaws, needing no further official mention." Ira Leonard, abandoned by Wallace, proceeded with Susan McSween's civil suit against Dudley for arson of her house and for libel by defamatory affidavits. But their venue had been changed by ring-eyed Judge Warren Bristol from knowledgeable Lincoln County to the November 1879 Doña Ana County grand jury in Mesilla. Ring death threats prevented Susan from traveling to appear, so Ira Leonard requested a continuance. Instead, on November 18th, Bristol declared her in contempt, forcing her to travel to Mesilla for a court appearance a week later. With Dudley's representation there by Catron's ring-eyed replacement as U.S. Attorney, Sidney Barnes, and with benefit of Dudley's having been exonerated by the military court, the jury found him not guilty of arson. The libel charge was abandoned. The ring-eyed Mesilla News of December 6th wrote that after the verdict, a spontaneous outburst of applause came from the large audience. As we will see in later talks, this would be the court, judge, and populace for jury selection that Billy Bonney, the only Lincoln County War participant without pardon, would face in 1881 to receive his intended ring-hanging sentence.